to remove the airbox lid, so take your air temperature sensor connector, push this in, and lift up. Now you can lift the lid up and pull it back. You'll see these little tangs in the front fit into the slots in the front of the airbox. Remove this bolt. You'll need a 5mm Allen that holds the front of the snorkel. Slides out. Then your snorkel can be lifted out of the airbox. Once your screws for the battery are removed, you pull this rubber strap down and away, flop it over on the side, and slide the battery out. Your next step is going to be removal of your air filter element. Bottom of your battery tray, you have two nuts that you will need a 10mm socket for. Chris has already removed them. About 3 airbox screws. You need a 4mm Allen wrench to do this. You have one located here inside the airbox. You have one located here. And another one on the left side in the same location as the right. Once the 3 airbox screws are removed, your next step is going to be loosening these clamps. So there we have it. Tube slid back into the airbox. Now you need an 8mm Allen socket and our X socket, and you will remove the 2 caliper bolts. You may need to rock the caliper back and forth to spread the pads a little bit, and we're going to move that right out of the way. Next, we're removing the left foot peg plate. This rear shock preload adjuster can stay bolted to the plate, but you do need to disconnect the shift linkage. Just a little clip on the back. Just slides out like that. You have to remove it, and this will pop off with the screwdriver. And that's removed, so that's out of the way. And best to put the clip back in so you don't lose it. Here is the clip, infamously known as the Jesus clip. Why? Because when you lose it, you'll say, Jesus Christ, where the fuck did that go? Fits in like this. You'll watch carefully. It goes through the side of the inside of the ball socket, and fits through another hole and protrudes back out here. Then the whole assembly swings around, clips into place. That is what holds the ball into the socket. So remove the upper right hand foot peg plate bolt. It screws into this tube. Hold on a second. It runs all the way across the top of the transmission. It is slotted to get a 19mm wrench on it. Inconveniently placed on the left side of the bike. And that's out. You have 2 wires that are zip tied to the frame. Right here. You need to cut the zip tie. Follow that connector up. This gets unplugged. And the other one is on the connector. Buried. Up under here. We're going to disconnect the fuel injectors. Squeeze the spring clip. Lift the injector off. This middle clip gets rotated and removed. On these, in the 1150s, these 2 bolts here have to be removed, and this whole injector assembly will come off. Which, in that matter, you can leave this attached. That doesn't really make a difference. And then airbox screws, one on each side. There's another one inside the airbox. Our next step is going to be removal of the starter. You do not need to disconnect any of the wires. You do need to use a 6mm Allen socket, remove this bolt, and there's another bolt way under here. Those are the only two holding the starter in place. You may have difficulty removing the starter from the engine block because there is a dowel pin in this hole. You can tap this to get it free. During reassembly, I coat that pin with copper anti-seize or Starburag's paste. Either one is applicable in that situation. We pull the starter back a little bit. Oh, we're caught on the wires. We gotta cut that zip tie here. That zip tie secures the wires to your side stand safety switch and over to your oil pressure switch. Now we can move that out of the way. Returning to the right side of the motorcycle, we have one clamp holding this exhaust system on at the moment because our rear has already been removed. Before we remove that though, we have some zip ties to cut. You'll see your oxygen sensor here, your O2 sensor. Follow the wire up and cut the zip ties that are holding it in place. Pay attention to the routing of this. On this model, it runs up through here in a bracket. As we follow this along, we have another zip tie here to cut. Working our way towards our connector, which is here. Once that is free, run it behind the wires. Pull our wire down between the throttle body and the transmission. And now we're loose. And now Chris can go after that exhaust clamp. So we try to get in and give this a good tap. There we go. Once this is free, this clamp will open up easier. Now you see we can move the clamp slightly side to side. This clamp is pinned. You see this hole in the top? There is a bump welded on the exhaust. You'll need a 15mm wrench for the nut on the right side of the shock, and a 14mm socket or wrench for the head of the bolt, which is on this screw, which holds the rear brake lines on, the master cylinder reservoir out. There, now those are free. Looking above the right and left cylinder heads, you're going to see that your subframe runs along here and is secured here. You'll need an 8mm hex to remove that bolt. Just above that is what all of this assembly pivots on. You'll need a 17mm socket. Just loosen that. You do not need to remove the nut. So give it a good 360-degree turn. Next step on this, this bolt here on each side needs to be removed. The nut above it needs to be just loosened. You also need to remove the Allen bolt that's here so that this brake line will be free from the frame. Now we're going after that Allen bolt in the front. We're going to remove that completely. We are going to remove this one here on the transmission, and then we will move over to the right side of the motorcycle again. Go ahead, Chris is going to remove that one. And the other one is not on the side like the left side, the other one is in the back here. The next thing you need to do is to feed a soft tie, something short, through the frame. You don't want to grab or be over any cables, brake hoses, or anything like that. So make sure your soft tie or strap is under everything. Next, we're going to use a motorcycle tie-down strap and attach from there to the rear of the bike. And you'll notice this zip tie right here, this harness is zip tied to the airbox. You don't need to redo that when you put this back together. That will free that harness up and allow us to raise this up some more. Now if we can disconnect this, and that runs in front of the airbox behind the frame, so we're going to pull that out and leave that hang. Now we can go up. At this point, we are going to disconnect our vent hose from the airbox. Now we can pull our airbox back. Alright, so now our airbox is free. Your fuel lines run between these two metal lines. Try not to bend the lines too much. You can tweak them a bit to get them out of the way. A common issue with oil heads: overfilling of the engine oil. This results in the airbox becoming filled with oil. There is a drain. This isn't all that bad, but that's a result of having the oil level too high. It pumps the excess oil into the airbox, which then gets whipped down, sucked into the throttle bodies, making the throttle bodies very slimy and leaving a trail of blue smoke behind you. We're going to go up some more, tighten our strap, and that should be all we need to get this transmission out. You are going to remove the middle left bolt. We have our two alignment dowels. This makes removal and reinstallation of the transmission a bit easier. Put the short one in, screw it in 4 or 5 full turns. It does not have to be tight, obviously. The next one we're going to remove is the bottom right. You have this metal bracket. Remember, that's where the oxygen sensor for the exhaust was zip tied to. The metal bracket runs across from that one to here and then has a 90-degree bend to it. The bolt above that has this funky little tab that holds the vacuum hose that goes to the throttle body. The bolt on the top has nothing. The top on the left has nothing. Middle on the left has this U-shaped tab on it. Get that bracket right out of the way. Screw this in. We will remove the other 3 bolts, the 2 on the top, 1 on the side, and then we can pull a transmission. Before we pull a transmission, since it's nice and accessible right now, we'll change the slave cylinder. So first step's going to be remove the 2 lines, and we'll pull the 3 bolts out and swap the slave cylinder. Clutch slave cylinder from the Oilhead in 1150s. As we can see, there's a little bearing in here in the center. Clutch rod rides in this. The clutch rod, when you pull the clutch in, spins at the engine RPM. This bearing, as we can see, has failed. It's very sloppy. What happens when that fails, as this one is done, is the entire piston spins in this bore. When that happens, the seal gets hot, fails, but it scores the inside of the bore, and then you have no clutch lever. It's very important to replace these, and from my experience, the ones directly from BMW have been inferior to the ones from Beemer Boneyard, despite the fact that it's the same thing made from Magura. BMW has to be different from the rest of the world. They use their own goofy bleeder. We're going to eliminate so that the average person can actually bleed the system. It's much easier to do this line off the bike because the assholes put red Loctite on these. One shitty bleeder gone. There's a Goodrich squeeze bleeder. Size is 10 millimeter by 1.0. Which threads right in. With this, all you have to do to bleed, to flush the clutch system, is loosen this, put a hose on it to a container, take your reservoir master cylinder off, and just keep adding fluid as you pump the lever until the fluid's nice and clear coming out the end of the bleeder. Make life easier on the 1150 specifically. I need to take the damn gear indicator out. 1100s, it's normally just disconnected from the harness. It's just two little metal tabs you have to squeeze, which I need two hands for. Okay, clip is released. Pull that right out of the way. It will not go through the transmission because the shitheads decided to make the hole too small. As large as this hole is, the gear indicator does not fit through it. Once you get the transmission moved back just a little bit, you're going to run into this mount hitting these two cables. You're going to have someone lift that up so that you can get the threaded portion under the cables. The easiest way to do that is use a long pry bar. Get on top of the engine case, not the transmission case, and just lift up. Alright, see, now we're clear. That's not what's holding us. There you go. If you look at the dowel pins here, you'll see how rusty they are. That is one of the problems that can be avoided by using copper anti-seize or even Staubberog's paste like we're going to use on the splines. You put it here, you put it all around this dowel pin, and then the little tiny pin for the starter. These components are balanced and the marks are not all together. So anytime you take one apart, take some white out and just mark a line, flywheel, and the two hard parts so that you can reassemble it the same way. Be careful if you're washing the parts. If you're going to wash them, engrave them also before you wash the marks off. To replace the clutch, you have 6 clutch cover bolts to remove. You can buy the special tool that wedges in here against the starter teeth to hold it in place. You can use a pry bar and very gently hold some tension between the starter ring gear and the bell housing of the engine. So once these 6 bolts are off, we're going to lever this whole clutch pack off. Okay, Chris has all of the bolts out. This came out nicely. Bold portion facing the engine, obviously, so your clutch rod pushes here to release the pressure that holds these two halves together. When you pull the clutch lever in and the rod pushes on the spring, these two pieces separate, allowing your friction disc to rotate freely in between. Very simple design. This is the important part. I use Stabarog's NBU 30 PTM. That is what the factory used. This is how much you need to do a spline lube. That is all. Just a little bit. Same if you're going to use Honda Moly, you might even want to use a little less. All you want to do is just coat these splines. Make sure you get deep into each valley. And that's it. You do not do the clutch disc. So before we put our Stabarogs away, we had difficulty with this pin because it's this dowel because it's rusty. Give that a little scrub. And if Chris pulls that starter back, I'll hit that little pin there, which gave us a little bit of grief. And then we're going to hit the other one up here as well. One more place you can use the Stabarogs. Take your clutch rod. You see this edge right here? This is what runs against the spring plate. Right there. If you do like most motorcyclists and you sit at a stop in first gear, the engine running with the clutch pulled in, you are pressing against this. So it's good to have some Stabarogs right here on this edge. Not a lot. We're not going nutty. Just give it a little coat. We have our alignment tool in place. So we're going to put the spring in. Make sure the spring sits in where it should be. Make sure your clutch pack is lined up. You want your alignment tool to spin freely throughout the process of installing these bolts and torquing them. You may have to press on this clutch pack to get the bolts started. That is because of the clutch spring.
Works wonders.
Set your torque wrench to 18 Newton meters. Mark it. I mark them green. Means it's torque. Do these in a star pattern. See, it still spins freely. We are done, and we are now ready to reinstall our transmission. Before we reinstall this transmission, I'd like to point something out. On your clutch rod, you have this little felt. Some people are mistaken in believing that this is an oil control device. It is not. As you see, the transmission shaft is hollow. That is where this rod goes. There is no oil getting through either end of this. This felt is here so that this clutch rod doesn't rattle around inside this shaft and make all kinds of noise. It has nothing to do with oil control. So even if you left this felt out, the worst you're going to have is a little bit of a noisy clutch rod at idle. You want to get your middle left guide pin and the lower right guide pin lined up. Slide this forward. You'll remember our little battery tray mount up top with the wires that go around the back of it. Now's the time to lift those up out of the way. Kind of push this transmission forward a little bit. The best way to do this, drawing the transmission to the engine, is by using nothing more than a T-handle and a couple of bolts. 4 if you need to. You just want to draw it in gently. You're not wailing this thing into place. Once you're comfortable with the fact that the transmission will mate up against the engine okay, you can remove all of your guide pins, install the rest of your bolts, and then these get torqued to 20 Newton meters. Now we're ready to reinstall the airbox. Remember what I said about the fuel lines. They always go between the two metal brake lines. We're good there. Now we have this clamp. We can start putting this frame down, paying extra close attention to the stuff on the right side. So you need to get the brake lines configured and everything else. So Chris is going to go on the left side of the bike. Okay, stop there. We want this out of the way so that doesn't get trapped. Brake lines are free. Those are doing okay. Let's continue down. You want to make sure the airbox is pressed forward when you get to this point, because it's very easy to break the back of the airbox when this comes down on top of it. Let's go ahead. More. Now you see where this is hitting on the airbox. So, up a little bit. Just move the airbox forward, Chris. Push the whole thing forward. Right now, we have the metal tab of the frame riding on top of the airbox. So I'm going to lift this up. Chris is going to pull the airbox towards him. Okay, there we go. Moving over to the left side. Again, we're looking at that little tab that the airbox mounts to. We see that it's resting on top of this harness. So Chris is going to lift the back of the subframe up a little bit. This harness needs to be shoved in. You might have to do some pushing around of this big bundle of wires, that harness and the group coming down. Fuel line goes behind that bundle of wires. And you need access to, you need to be able to have a clear shot to the airbox screws. So you got a little poking and prodding to do to move stuff around to get it lined up properly. Our frame is down, things are in position, our brake lines are routed properly. Now you can clamp them together. Put some copper anti-seize on the screw, even though it has blue Loctite on it. I suggest you use the copper anti-seize. So the next time you need to remove this when you do your spline lube, it comes off without snapping off. Pay attention to the brake line routing. If you need to bend it and tweak it here and there, you can do that. Just don't fold it in half. Don't crush the line. Common problem when people dislodge their fuel tank, remove their fuel tank to change a battery on like an RS model or an R1100R, R850R, whatever, GS. They take the tank off and this cable gets dislodged, then they start the bike up and it runs a bag of shit. You have to always make sure that these are seated back in their pockets. So at this point you should have your airbox screws in. Remember there's one here, one on each side, here, one on the right side. Remember your gear and neutral switches. Feed those through here, like such. Pull them up. They are going to get plugged in up top here. We have our bolts into the frame, 4 bolts. These all get torqued to 47 Newton meters on the R1100 RT. .47 Newton meters also applies to the nut on each side. Put a wrench on one side and tighten the other side of the torque wrench. Remember your battery tray, 2 washers, 2 nuts. Our frame is all bolted down and torqued. We are now going to move on to our fuel lines where they connect to the fuel injectors. Alcohol is very convenient here. Squirt some in there. Push that on. Take your clip, put it into place, rotate it so it can't back out. Plug that in. This side's done. Do the same on the other side. Next thing we're going to do is move these air tubes in. We're also going to put alcohol on this O-ring. You can replace it. If you find that it's too big and floppy, throw it in the freezer for a little while and it'll reduce the size. These air tubes really only go one way. See this line? This goes on the outside, horizontal. It is sometimes easier to squirt some alcohol up in here and push the tube back in. You want to make sure that this O-ring doesn't get pushed out of place. And we'll do the same on the other side. Before we install the exhaust, get your copper anti-seize. It's the end of this bottle. Give it a good coat all the way around. A little bit of preparation. This can all go together smoothly. Get your exhaust in line. Remember, the O2 sensor lead needs to hang out here. Yep, you're on. That's perfect. While Chris is putting that mount together, I'm going to remove the nut, the washer, and the little half moon from this. Give this stud a real good coat of copper anti-seize. If you put too much on here, the worst that's going to happen is it's going to drip off once you run the bike. I try to add a little here where that half moon presses against the clamp. Sometimes they bond together. And again, this is only done so the next time this has to come off, it comes apart easily. This clamp gets torqued to 55 Newton meters. Then we are going to route our oxygen sensor up and get that hooked up. Route this up through here. And this one actually ran over the back into this clamp here. Route this up to here. We go under. These into here. And we'll zip tie that here. These can be a little tight getting past the adjustable nut. There you go. Don't forget the shim. I do support putting copper anti-seize on your lug bolts. Now is a good time to inspect your brake pads. There's plenty of life left in them. You're going to drop the caliper back on. Hopefully you haven't stepped on the rear brake pedal or anything foolish like that since this has been apart. Again, start these by hand, please. You're threading into very soft aluminum. This front one has the funky bracket. I'll show you why in a moment. You'll notice there is a notch on the bottom of that bracket. That notch goes in front of the rear drive. This little grommet here fit. There we go. These Allen head caliper bolts are torqued to 30 Newton meters. And done. Before you put the right foot peg plate on, remember your brake rod that goes in the master cylinder. Easy way to install this. You can just stick it up in here, but you'll notice that it's going to be kind of hard to get the rubber to fit here where it's supposed to be. So pinch it, pull it off, get your rubbing alcohol out, a little squirt down in there. Fit this on first. There, that's the way it should be. Now you can put that up, squeeze the rubber into place, and that'll hang there nicely. Take your clip off, get your foot peg plate into position, get the master cylinder's reservoir out of the way, take your brake switch wiring, stuff that up here for now. There, that'll hold us in place for now. Now we're going to line up the master cylinder and get that bolted into position. Move the brake pedal as needed to line up. Pin for the clip. There we go. That's in place. Chris is using the 5mm Allen socket to get the 2 bolts that hold the master cylinder. Rear brake master cylinder bolts are in. Torque those to 8 Newton meters. These foot peg plates bolts get torqued to 18 Newton meters, 20, 18. Remaining electrical on the right side is going to be the ABS sensor here and your brake light switch. Brake lights wire comes up here, runs along this frame rail, then is going to curve and go up to here. Your anti-lock brake sensor lead is also going to follow a similar path once it reaches this junction. So you can run both of them through a zip tie up here. That one there. Close this up. This is going to get packed with dielectric grease, and we're going to connect these and bundle them out of the way. So we're just going to zip tie them just like this. Good. On the left side, as I mentioned earlier, this is missing the little felts. These are relatively easy to install. Throw a little bit of alcohol on them. And that's it. Once you do that, you want a little bit of assembly lube on that ball, just to provide a little bit of lubrication in the joint. Now we have this end, have a little linkage, and remember we need to take the clip out, which Chris has already done. Snap that into place. Get that, let's lock that into place. We need to remove the clip from the bottom. Swing that out of the way. Go to our foot peg plate. You see here it's missing the felt. Here's our replacement felt. A little alcohol. Push that into place. A little bit of assembly lube on the ball. And now, where is the Jesus clip? It's right there. It's right here. Now you're going to fit this together, and this is kind of a bear to get that ball pressed in. So we are getting closer to completion every minute. You have these 3 bolts, here, here, here. Copper anti-seize on them. Those will get torqued to 18 to 20 Newton meters. You have this bolt here, which will be 20 Newton meters. And don't forget the one hidden in the back. Remember the tab on the cover for the rear wheel that fits into the tab. The little groove in the wheel. Line it up. Smack it into place. That's all you do. Make sure your throttle turns as it should. You can install the tank, install your panels, and go for a test ride.